I meditate constantly, and by that I mean I don't like do a bong drum, or I don't sit on a carpet and say whatever. I trace the origin and the provenance of every thought and emotion, so I can understand what's the source of how I feel and what I'm thinking. So that works for me. The problem with that, it's not just that, by the way, because in addition to that, I have sort of a long-term brain damage from skull fracture that I got at Burnside when I was in my 20s. So I have a 30th percentile working memory, which is kind of like having a really fast computer with very little RAM, or a car that can potentially go fast but with really small wheels. So the adaptation I've used is what's called cognitive chunking, and I use objects, if you will, metaphor, allegory, tropes, simile, to sort of as a coping mechanism. So when you put that two together, you put the use of cognitive chunks to overcome a long-term brain damage, and you do the meditation, you understand the metaphor before you memorize the labels, because that's actually, like, that's what I do. And then the other thing is that I meditate, right? And what I end up meditating on, for instance, is why my van is having an issue with inconsistent fuel flow. And then I end up reconciling it as an allegorical framework within which I can evaluate the reconciliation between soft capital and what we call hard capital, money. And so for me, that ends up being an equivalency, but it's just an interesting and useful framework. So let me begin with the thing with my van. What I've got is inconsistent fuel flow because I've got inconsistent fuel pressure, likely due to a washer in the fuel injector, which I actually put in myself. I did it a year ago, but I probably did it wrong, which happens. So the fuel flow is delivered in liquid form under high pressure, even when it's warm, until it gets to the fuel injector. Then it goes pop, and then when it atomizes, turns into vapor, and then not quite vapor, but atomizes, and then it burns. But if there's inconsistent fuel pressure, that actually screws up the ignition. Not the ignition, but it screws up the ability for the van to run well. So that is an interesting allegorical equivalency to this reconciliation between, I'm going to put my fingers up, 5 of them for a reason, what we call soft capital and hard capital. Soft capital would be the atomized state of capital. So, and it's a hierarchy. We've got time, attentiveness, relationships, trust, and wisdom. And I actually shared an article yesterday that talked about what those are. If I can get 5 hours of your time, that's great. But if it's not attentive time, if I get 5 hours of your time and you spend 4.5 hours on the toilet looking at memes, it's not good time. If I can get 5 hours of your attentive time, now I've got something of value. And over time, we end up having a relationship, and in time you build trust, and then from there you've got wisdom because you learn through cycles. And then there's a gateway between these forms of soft capital and the hard capital, which we know is money, although it's not money. Capital is resource used to bring about an outcome, typically on behalf of a community. Money is something you spend on yourself. The stewards of capital don't understand that, and that's why they spend our capital on themselves as if it's their money. Separate aside. Anyway, that's what's on my mind. I've had this correspondence with my friend Ruth right now, talking about this hobby of mine of resurrecting dead vehicles. And if you're going to rebuild the engine, you at some point try to start it, and you turn it over, you turn the key. You're doing this thing with the gas pedal called fluting. You're just barely touching it. You're trying to find that balance between too much fuel and not enough fuel. And that is sort of like that thing you're trying to do when you're starting an endeavor. How do you reconcile these 5 forms of soft capital to the flow of hard capital known as money, so you can have a deterministic output from an economic engine? That's what we've been doing. That is the anti-fragile model that we've been working on since 2020. And it's our supposition that that's how you ground and solidify the old-timey values that basically preserve a culture, and then sustain it with the flow of capital. That's what we've been doing. And I'm happy to report that it's working. So with that, I have to actually go and work on the van.